licensed professional counselor and therapist who's worked for decades in the field of mental health, first at community mental health agencies and then in private practice. Her research interests are in data integration in healthcare and clinical research, the use of geospatial data in healthcare and clinical research, the use of geographic information systems in healthcare and clinical research, psychometrics, patient-centered care, and personalized medicine. So she today is defending her dissertation proposal. I see that a few people have turned their videos on, and I've been encouraging people to do that, although I know sometimes people have reasons they can't, and actually I'm going to be entering a reason like that in a moment. So I'm going to, at least at the beginning of the talk, turn my video off, but I encourage everyone to keep their video on, and when I can put mine back on, I will do so. So I will turn it over to Lily.
Thank you, Bill, for that awesome introduction. And yes, it's helpful to me if you have cameras on, just so I don't feel like I'm talking to my laptop here. So let me share my screen, and somebody might need to pipe up if this does not work as expected. Okay, so can you guys see my?
We're seeing your view.
Oh, okay, that's not good. Let me try that again. Sorry. Okay. Of course, I have like a million slides to get through too. Huh. Okay, now share as. Oh, there we go. Stop sharing. Let me see. What if I do that and switch? Nope. I think I need to do different kinds of sharing here. Oh, here we go. Ah, success. Okay. So welcome to my proposal defense. Today I'm going to talk about data quality in the context of clinical social determinants of health research. So the background here is that earlier this year, an article in JAMIA outlined a new subfield of informatics, social informatics, which is devoted to the application of information technologies to capture and apply social data in conjunction with health data to improve clinical care and advance individual and population health. So what social informatics does is use social determinants of health data from informatics resources like EHRs, claims data, and mHealth data, and it uses that to inform research and enhance patient care. And social informatics rose from one of the objectives in the NLM's most recent 10-year strategic plan. And that objective is to develop data standards and processes for accessing information and accelerating standards for the social, behavioral, and environmental aspects of health. And both AMIA and the NLM have been emphasizing social determinants recently because there's been an increased understanding of just how much these non-clinical factors and contexts influence patient health. So social determinants data gets used lots of ways, but one of its primary applications is that it's used for health equity research. And the goal of health equity research is to help us better understand why people have different health outcomes, and also how we can make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to attain their full health potential. And now that we've been looking at and using social determinants data more and more frequently, it's become more clear that this data is often very messy, and we don't have many ways to tell if it's good or any formalized ways to improve it. And if we're not careful about the quality of the data, then we really can't guarantee that any research we perform with it is yielding valid or useful insights. So this is an important issue because poor data quality can cause problems with bias, reliability, and validity. So my work intends to close that gap by looking carefully at the data quality issues that are specific to social determinants of health research and delving into the details of how those problems are identified and addressed. So here's an example of what I mean when I say that this data is often messy and that it can cause problems when we try to use it for research. So this is OHSU's COVID-19 dashboard from the middle of October. This was created by Faiza Khan at OHSU. And we know that people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, but we don't know exactly why that is. So if we're investigating that issue and we zero in on just the part of the dashboard that categorizes data about race and ethnicity, we can see that there's a significant number of patients whose race is given as unknown or declined. In other words, there's a lot of missing and incomplete data. And second, race and ethnicity data is self-reported by patients, and the distinction between race and ethnicity is usually confusing to patients and to most people. So patients are choosing how to categorize themselves, but they don't know what those categories mean because the categories are confusing. So, for example, are Hispanic people represented at all in the case by race area, and if so, where? So OHSU and other institutions that collect and report this information, they've been working on being more careful about how they collect it going forward, but we still have to use this current data set, right? And what can we do to make that data more usable so we can figure out how and why people of color are more profoundly affected by COVID-19, right? Are they being more severely affected because of some genetic factor, or is what we're seeing here the result of something more closely related to income or occupation, or maybe even access to care? And those are important distinctions because those two explanations of why we're seeing this, they have very different recommendations for how we can stop the spread. So because social determinants are these non-clinical factors like race and ethnicity and income and physical environment, that means that we need to use non-clinical data in order to build our research data sets. And there are two ways to get that non-clinical data. And the first method is to rely exclusively on information about the patient that's just contained within the EHR. But these social determinants information like race and ethnicity and income levels and exposure to environmental pollutants, that's either really sparsely collected in the health record or it's not collected at all. So pretty much all we have in the EHR is limited to demographic information, with some exceptions. But what little information we do have about social determinants suffers from data quality problems that are very typical in secondary use EHR data, right? So that's because those are things you guys are familiar with, but that's things like data that's missing or incorrect or heterogeneous or sequestered in unstructured text fields. And this article kind of highlights what I'm talking about. So the authors looked at which social determinants were available in the EHR, and they concluded that most were not available or were only very sparse. And they tried using NLP to pull additional information from the structured text fields about some of those social determinants factors. And although NLP did find some additional information, it was really quite modest improvement in what they could find. But these authors did find that around 95% of the patients had zip code information somewhere in their record. So even with NLP, many social determinants of health researchers find it too limiting to only use the EHR as the only source of social determinants data. But because we usually do have zip codes from the patient record, that's where geographic information systems can play a role, because researchers will oftentimes take the data from the EHR and use patient addresses to link that health data with data from external sources. Usually that's data from the community or the population level, like neighborhood data from the US Census or air quality data from the EPA. And linking data that way allows us to get a much richer picture of the non-clinical factors that influence patient health, and incorporate these novel variables into our clinical research. So social determinants research is different from other kinds of secondary use research in that it's far more likely to utilize this data linkage process and to utilize external data sets. And when we're working with these integrated social determinants research data sets, what that means is that we've not only got all of the error from the EHR data, but now we've compounded that with all the error from the external data set, which means that bias and error can be introduced as a result of bad data from the patient record, bad geospatial address data, bad data from the external data set, and sometimes all three of those. So we need to acknowledge and do something about the fact that social determinants data sets have a huge potential for error and for data quality problems. Because as I found in my preliminary work on wildfire, this makes social determinant studies more prone to type 1 error, which is a fancy way of saying that it's really easy to lose the signal and all of this noise when we're doing research with social determinants data. And the question is, how do we solve that problem? And how do we ensure that we don't lose the signal and all the noise? So in health research or informatics research, like as in other fields that rely heavily on data science, the work of this data quality assessment and improvement, it largely takes place when we're cleaning, transforming, and integrating data. So basically all the things that we do when we're preparing the data set for analysis. And as many of you know, data wrangling tends to be very time consuming. Some research has even shown that it's the lengthiest step of a quantitative research project. It also tends to be conducted in a very ad hoc manner. And while there are some general guides for doing it, there aren't any that are specific to social determinants of health research. And because this field of social informatics is so new, there are very few, if any, protocols or agreed upon methods that are available to guide researchers. So again, that means researchers take this very ad hoc approach to data quality improvement. And which means that researchers will get like wildly different results, even from the same data set. So this, as this article in Nature demonstrated. So the authors of this article gave 29 different research teams the same data set and the same research question, which was, are dark-skinned soccer players more likely to get a red card than light-skinned players? And they found that the findings from the research teams varied a lot, as you can see here. And because these researchers use such a wide variety or grab bag of methodologies, that can also make it difficult to judge the quality of the research results, right? Like, how do we know which of these results is the right one or the best one? It also means that the time and effort involved in data preparation tends to be very steep, which can be a rate limiting factor for research projects, right? It's harder to get them done quickly. And this ad hoc approach also really impedes reproducibility. And medicine in general is already doing kind of a poor job with reproducibility compared to other scientific fields, as this other article in Nature showed. So to help resolve this problem, I intend to examine the data quality needs of social determinants of health researchers by working to identify the data quality problems, requirements, and assessment methods that are specific to this particular field of research. And in order to accomplish that, I want to pursue these three specific aims. And all of these aims are basically a process that's building towards developing a checklist that will be, and the checklist will be the product of several studies, right? And the first study will be literature-based and is intended to characterize the data quality needs specific to social determinants of health research. The second study will be very highly structured, data-driven, descriptive case study that's intended to look at the practicalities of assessing and addressing data quality issues. And that case study will kind of document a data quality improvement workflow that will ultimately inform the checklist that I'm going to create with my third aim. So in the third and final aim, I'm going to develop and refine an exploratory solution, the checklist, over several iterations. So, like I said, these three aims are intended to work together as an iterative incremental process that culminates in the development of a data quality improvement checklist that will help guide clinical social determinants of health researchers during the process of improving data quality, will help reduce error, and it will help increase study validity and reliability. And this iterative and incremental development process has been used in computer science since the 1930s, and it's kind of this series of plan, do, study, act cycles that work together. Okay, so I'm going to start here with my first aim. In this first aim, I plan to conduct a systematic literature review. And the approach I'm planning to use is a realist review, which is this theory-driven, deductive, and systematic review. So realist review is grounded in practice, and it's focused on testing the validity of proposed solutions. And the primary advantage of realist review is that it's mindful of how theories can be applied in certain contexts, with a particular emphasis on healthcare contexts. So the theory that I'm going to apply in this review is the harmonized model of EHR data quality, which for some reason isn't showing up on the top. Sorry about that. And the context is clinical social determinants of health research. And this harmonized model is essentially a terminology in a way to conceptualize and define data quality issues. And it consists of these three major elements: conformance, completeness, plausibility. So completeness is like whether or not this element is present. Plausibility is like whether or not this element seems like it would be correct. And conformance is more of a technical requirement, like does this element have conform to the values that we were expecting? So the goal of this aim is to use that existing EHR data quality framework, the harmonized model, to conduct a review of the literature, the social determinants of health literature, in order to identify and describe the data quality needs specific to clinical social determinants research. And the objectives are to extract information from the literature on the data quality issues that are typically encountered during that research process, and then categorize them using the harmonized model to see, and also to see if the data quality issues in social determinants of health research is similar to those found in other secondary use research. So here are the steps that I plan to take to fulfill this aim. I'm not going to read all of these because I'm going to detail them. But first, I intend to search for articles focused on clinical social determinants research. So articles that also incorporate elements of data accuracy, validity, introduction of bias, related data quality terms, because data quality is not a mesh term, but data accuracy is. And I've already consulted with Andrew Hamilton to identify the ideal search terms and search strategy. And he recommended using a combination of PubMed, using the terms here, and then an adjacency search in Ovid Medline. And here's the terms for that adjacency search. And I also want to use IEEE Explore and Google Scholar so I can find articles from fields outside of medicine. And once this body of literature has been identified, I plan to import these articles into EndNote and then screen them for relevance based on title and abstract. And then use a snowball technique to find any literature that I might have missed in that initial search, and then kind of use Scopus to comb through the citations from that first round of articles, and then repeat the process of gathering and screening that second round of articles too. So articles will be excluded if they're not in English, if they're not original research, or if they pertain to social determinants of health research that's conducted without patient data, i.e. if they're not from an EHR, registry, etc. And information about the discarded articles will be tracked and entered into a spreadsheet or database. And I'll give justifications for their exclusion also and document that. So my contingency plan, if the number of identified articles is low, like less than 50, then I want to expand the search maybe to include articles about social determinants of health that are not specifically focused on data quality, but maybe identify those issues as a limitation of the research. Okay, so the next step is that I want to appraise these articles according to the elements of the harmonized data quality model that I showed you earlier. And to do that, I'm going to use an extraction template in Qualtrics you can see here. And I want to use this template to characterize the data quality issues that are identified in each of the articles, and then also categorize them according to the specific social determinants that they're examining, right? Like, are they looking at race? Are they looking at environmental exposures, etc.? And once I've collected all of that extracted information, I want to tabulate it into something that looks roughly like this shell table. And then I want to aggregate and compare that information and see if I can identify any patterns and what generalizations I can make. And then compare the results of these studies against each other to see if they validate each other and see if they agree. And I also am particularly interested in whether there are data quality issues that affect research on a specific factors, right? Like, is race or ethnicity data particularly problematic? Or is data about the physical environment better than other types, etc.? And then I also want to make those comparisons I talked about earlier about comparing the findings of other secondary use data quality studies to see if social determinants of health research is similar to other types of secondary use data. Right now, my plan is to extract and process the data myself so I can get a good feel for it. But if that's too time consuming, then my contingency plan is to involve other students in order to expedite that. So what I hope to have when I'm finished with AIM 1 is a better understanding of the data quality needs specific to clinical social determinants research, right? Like, which categories of data quality are most problematic and whether some social determinants variables are more prone to certain kinds of issues. And then that will be used to inform the data quality improvement checklist that I intend to create for AIM 3. So for AIM 2, what I want to do is demonstrate how data quality issues are identified, assessed, and addressed during the actual process of social determinants of health research. And I want to do that with a case study. And this AIM, or this case study, will be an in-depth examination of the methods and workflow that I used for a study I've already conducted and that I'm currently wrapping up. And with that study, I examined the effect of an environmental determinant of health, in this case, wildfire smoke exposure, on patients with cystic fibrosis. And in that research project, the outcome of interest was severe pulmonary exacerbations. And for that, we pulled data from the cystic fibrosis registry. And then I used patient zip codes to link their health records to community level information from air pollution monitors. So on the right is a map that I made that shows locations of all the air quality monitors in Oregon. And I used that to figure out if those patients had been exposed to wildfire smoke, and then see if there was a relationship between wildfire smoke exposure and severe pulmonary exacerbation. And that work was primarily epidemiological, and I've already written it up into a manuscript that's ready for submission. But I want to be clear about the fact that this that first manuscript's not directly part of my dissertation work. Because what I want to do for AIM2 is look at the choices that I made in order to improve the quality of that data set, the data set I used for that study, and look carefully and in depth at all the decisions and show how they impacted the research results. So my intention is to document the data quality improvement pipeline from start to finish, and to map out not only what the data quality problems were, but more importantly, how they were addressed. And here are all the steps that I intend to take to do that, which I'm going to detail on the following slides. So the final deliverable of AIM2 will be a detailed map that documents the data cleaning and transformation process. And I intend to structure that map using an approach that's inspired by fault tree analysis. And this map will document the actions that I took when I was addressing the data quality problems within that particular data set. So while AIM1 is about identifying the data quality needs typical for social determinants data, AIM2 is a case study in how I identified them and worked to resolve them. And I want to use fault tree analysis here because it's a form of root cause analysis that's often used in engineering and sometimes in medicine epidemiology as a way to improve reliability and quality by plotting out the process of decision making and its consequences. So the first step towards creating that map is to characterize the social determinants data in the data set. Again, using that harmonized model of the EHR data quality that I talked about earlier. And I want to look at all of the social determinants variables that are available in that data set and use the harmonized model framework to categorize those problems. So the tabulated results will probably look something like this, although note that this is a dummy table, so these numbers are synthetic. And you'll notice that in this table, there's a column listing the actions that I took to transform the messy data into clean data, right? Like whether I filtered the data, whether I corrected it, whether I inferred it. For example, this bottom row here describes the age data, which has some elements that could be characterized by the harmonized model as implausible. Right, so this is a plot of the age data, which as you can see is roughly normal. But it does have this really long tail here. And I considered the presence of these elderly patients in the data set implausible because although the prognosis for people with cystic fibrosis has improved, it's still unusual for that population to live until old age. So I consulted with the clinician I've been working with, Dr. Aaron Trimble, and he explained that the cystic fibrosis diagnosis contains a number of phenotypes and that the older patients represent an unusual, far milder variant of the cystic fibrosis gene or genes. Essentially, is what he told me is that those people don't really have cystic fibrosis, at least not how we commonly define it. So I felt like it improved the validity of the data to remove those patients from the data set because they have this unusual phenotype. They're not really representative of the cystic fibrosis population, and they're probably only going to muddy the signal because they're less likely to experience the outcome of interest. They don't have as many severe pulmonary exacerbations. They're not as sensitive to environmental triggers as the people with the more common cystic fibrosis phenotype are. And the research data set does not include phenotype information, so I can't remove everyone with that phenotype, but I can filter by age and get some of them, right? So I removed those implausible elderly outliers, which reshapes the data somewhat. And then over here on the left, with the red arrow, you can see we have 0-year-olds. Now, that seemed implausible to me because in the past, people weren't diagnosed with cystic fibrosis until it starts causing problems for them. For example, like a child who isn't gaining weight or has an unexpected respiratory crisis. And also I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just missing data that somehow got recorded as null, and then it accidentally showed up as a 0 rather than simply as missing. So I again consulted with the clinician I was working with, and he told me that it's definitely possible that there are, in fact, babies in the data set, i.e. 0-year-olds, because a couple of years ago, we started testing for cystic fibrosis at birth. So people with the diagnosis now start showing up in the registry much earlier than they used to. But as neonates, they can't have been exposed to wildfire smoke. They haven't had the opportunity to have a severe pulmonary exacerbation yet. So again, they're not going to be able to tell us anything about our outcome of interest, and they're really going to only muddy any signal that might be there. So part of the data quality improvement process also included filtering all of the newborns out of this data set. So moving forward with AIM2, once I've documented all those decisions that were made about the data and why they were made and how those choices affected the validity of the data and eliminated this unnecessary noise, then next I want to demonstrate quantitatively how those choices made during that cleaning and transformation, how that improved the data quality quantitatively and affected the final research product. And I want to do that by comparing results from the statistical analysis using those two data sets, right? The raw data set and the cleaned data set. So how each step that I documented has affected these final results. So to do that, I plan to run tests for things like sensitivity and specificity and normality and variable selection and model fit. And for differences in distribution of the variables, and also I want to calculate the relative change of those tests before and after cleaning. And I want to compare these results both purely in quantitative terms, but also in terms of interpretability and generalizability, right? So for example, a log transformation might make the data more normal and would represent an improvement from a purely statistical standpoint. But from a clinical standpoint, that transformation would make the resulting model more difficult to interpret. So here are the results of the original univariate model before cleaning and pre-processing, or really I just did enough cleaning so that the analysis will actually run. And if you note that the results here, they're not statistically significant and they have a pretty high deviance. So for AIM2, the final deliverable will show the data wrangling process that got me from these numbers here, basically the raw data, to this, where you might note the results are statistically significant and the deviance of the model is far lower. So obviously there's a lot of steps here, in that not just removing the outliers from the age data. But basically AIM2 will be about documenting everything that was necessary for this signal to emerge from all of that noise. And the final deliverable for AIM2 would be this map that's inspired by fault tree analysis. That would be a far more detailed version of this here, but where I start with this raw data set on the lower left side, including that description of all the social determinants variables that I created in the earlier step that you saw on the table. And I have this kind of series of logic gates that show how the data preparation decisions and how that changed the resulting statistical analysis at each step. And the arrows here sort of depict the data quality assessment method. And I should note that fault tree analysis, typically it works by calculating the likelihood of an outcome happening given each event in the process, but I'm adapting it to instead show how each decision gradually changes the results until after a lot of cleaning and pre-processing, we get to the final results that are in the upper right-hand corner. However, data munging includes a lot of steps. So I gave this a pretty significant chunk of time on my timeline. But if it takes even longer than what I've set aside and it's throwing off my schedule too much, then my contingency plan is to take and maybe do this as like a higher level overview and to simplify the issues into much broader causes of data quality problems, like maybe instead identifying how those problems were introduced or looking at correlates of data quality problems. Oh, right. So that's what I plan to do for AIM2, is basically document this entire data quality improvement pipeline. And then once I have that in hand, I want to use that for my final aim, which is AIM3, where I plan to develop a checklist to cleaning, transforming, and integrating data in clinical social determinants of health research. And to do that, I want to take that detailed map of data quality, of the data quality improvement process that I will create in AIM2, and then generalize it into something that can be used more broadly for clinical social determinants research of all kinds. So the target audience for this AIM is clinical researchers who are engaged in social determinants research, and it's intended to be cited like in the methods section of their papers. And this checklist is meant to help improve the quality of the data that's used in social determinants research while also encouraging reproducibility. And to develop this checklist, I want to use the iterative incremental process that I talked about earlier. So the first iteration of the checklist will draw upon a well-established prior work. The second iteration will adjust the checklist based on experience applying it to a real-world research project, not a different one from the one I've already finished. And the third iteration will be based on evaluations from potential users. So for the first step, I want to use this foundational work from Ram and Joe on data cleaning and use that deliverable that I will create in AIM2, that whole detailed process with all the data transformation steps, and adapt what Ram and Joe have done to the specific needs of social determinants researchers, right? So Ram and Joe outlined these phases that you see listed here on the right: data analysis, transformation, workflow, mapping rules, etc. And I want to use this, using this iterative incremental process, take those phases that they described and use them as a scaffold to create the first iteration of the checklist, right? So use what I did in AIM2 and use that to adapt the phases to the needs of clinical social determinants researchers. So the first iteration might look something like this very preliminary one here, right? So for example, if you were doing social determinants research and you wanted to make sure that you'd be able to stratify the data set by age, for example. Phase 1 of the data cleaning, you might want to check to make sure that all of the data is type int, or that you create another column for age categories, or it might be important in phase 2 to standardize the race and ethnicity data and make sure that the data from people who identify with more than one race, for example, is all treated the same way, because that is typically a problem that people encounter working with race and ethnicity data. So that's how I want to create that first iteration. And the second iteration will be based on experience applying this checklist, the first iteration of the checklist, to the work of the N3C Social Determinants of Health Data Quality Project. So I've been participating in this group for the past month, and it's a group that includes a lot of very highly involved experts in social determinants and data quality research, and they recently started a quality assurance team. So that provides me with this mature and really important use case on which to refine and test this checklist that I want to create. And specifically, I want to work with the team to prepare publicly available data sets for analysis and work with them to create this data quality pipeline or refine it. So I want to apply the checklist to this work, observe how well it performs, revise it based on what works well and what does not. And my idea is to ensure that this checklist is generalizable for use across a variety of clinical social determinants data sets. So the final iteration of this checklist will be based on feedback from somewhere like 5 to 6 experienced researchers. And for that, I plan on soliciting the feedback of researchers using semi-structured interviews. And I want to just have a handful of kind of open-ended questions that are focused on usability. And I chose usability as the most important metric, first and foremost, because I want this checklist to be something that actually gets used, but also because the operational definition of usability is actually quite similar to that for data quality, right? So John Brook, when he introduced the system usability scale in 1996, he defined usability as appropriateness for a purpose, which is exactly how Wang and Strong defined data quality in their landmark article that came out the same year. So usability, I feel, is a really good metric because it encapsulates a lot of the concepts that are intrinsic to data quality. And my plan is to schedule interviews with the researchers individually and then provide them with the checklist like a week or so prior to the interview and ask them to examine it in advance. And this semi-structured interview will contain open-ended questions that are based loosely on the system usability scale, and which is this validated, efficient, clear way to gather reliable data about usability. So I'm not specifically going to use this checklist, but I will draw upon it to create the questions for the semi-structured interview. And then using the feedback from researchers, then I'll create that final iteration of the guidelines, which I will, of course, gather into manuscript and submit publication. So this is my timeline for completing all of this work, which my intention now is to complete it by the fall term 2021. And I've tried to mention my contingency plans as appropriate throughout the presentation. But of course, COVID. So, you know, I am the parent of a kid who goes to public school, a younger kid who goes to public school, and would definitely be easier to meet this timeline if public schools are reopened. And it's possible that if they don't reopen, or they decide not to reopen at the end of January, then that might slow my progress a lot and extend this timeline, which isn't really an obstacle that I have a complete solution for. So if any of you have experience working with kids with autism and you really want to babysit, please hit me up. I'm totally open to that. Okay. These are the select references. And also I want to thank a bunch of people, particularly my DAC, which is Nicole Weiskopf, Dion Chase, Miguel Marino, and Michelle Rybar. And thank you guys for being so generous with your time and expertise. I'm also the co-authors on the first manuscript I worked on, Dr. Erin Trimble and Dr. Bethany Collins here in pulmonology at OHSU, and all of the really graciously helpful staff at DMICE who've been so supportive of me in like a million different ways, particularly Diane, Dr. Andrea Ilg, and Lynn Schwabe. And thank you to my family for allowing me to neglect them so I could do this. And thank you to my fellow students for keeping me sane. I appreciate that. Okay, so can now stop sharing and address any questions you might have. Oh, there we go.
Actually, Lily, this is Bill. Great talk, and I know this time has been challenging for you, and also many other students and faculty who have young children. So we appreciate that you've continued to make progress. Could you actually put your specific where the slide that has the 3 aims back up? I just have a question.
Let me get to that. Sorry. So, is it?
Are you
This
sharing?
one?
Oh, there we
Yeah,
go. Okay,
sorry. Is
great.
it this one?
Maybe
Or
the one that lists the text of the 3 aims.
yes. Okay. This one. Cool. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder. I know part of it is I don't know if you've discussed this with your committee. I'm not crazy about the word checklists kind of coming out of a dissertation. That's more, I think, a matter of style. But it makes me wonder, though. Here you are dealing with people's data sets and how they can hopefully make their data sets better. Whether there are any data science methods, tools that could be developed that that help the process along rather than just for them to have a checklist. And I'm kind of thinking out loud here. I mean, I'd have to think this really through, but almost to the standpoint of, is there some kind of, I don't know, tool that people could run on their data and the different iterations of their data, like you actually showed in AIM 2. That's actually why I wanted to get the 3 aims back up. Whether there might be something there that would, provide, people with social determinants data more than just a checklist, but maybe a tool to help them determine what's the best way to analyze their data and any kind of transformations they're making to it. Whether those are beneficial or not.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm just wondering those sorts of things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good idea, like some sort of like tool in Python or something that I could develop. Is that what you had in mind?
I think something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
If it's even feasible, but I'm just thinking of the kind of value that as I've said in other presentations, we always hope that informatics dissertations, somehow develop new methods, in addition to, findings and so forth. So I don't know. It's just something to think about with yourself and your committee.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea. I guess I found like a lot of those tools, you have to keep updating them, right? If you engineer them, if you engineer the software. And so I wanted something that was maybe a little could last, I guess, have a longer shelf life. So that was one thought for why I wanted to do it this way. And the other way is the other reason is that, in the future, once I've graduated, to apply for another award or a grant where I could use this and say, like, okay, my intention is to use this work to develop some specific tool, right? And then that would be the basis of my grant application. Some kind of, K award type situation. So that's another thought too. Initially, I was calling these like guidelines or recommendations, but it was pointed out to me like, do I really have the kind of experience as a researcher yet to be like the person who can put forth guidelines. And I was like, well, that's a fair criticism. So I kind of downgraded it from guidelines to a checklist, which I felt was more reasonable, I guess, or was given my level of experience. But you know, if there's a format that other people either in this presentation right now or in my deck think would work better, I would totally be willing to do that too.
Sure. I mean, we can let them weigh in, or other people might have other questions.
Mm-hmm.
See, there's a few in the chat.
Yeah. Let me see if I can go there. Okay. Data cleaning flowchart. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to do with AIM2. To answer Aaron's point, like AIM2 to do multiverse analysis. That's a good way to put it. Like, this is what this would do. This is what this would do. At this point for AIM 1 and 2, what's your hunch or hypothesis about what you would find? So that's a good question. One of the things I think might show up is that address data will be particularly problematic because a lot of those linked data sets that are used so frequently in social determinants research are so heavily dependent on address data, right? You can't do the linkage if you don't have a patient's address or zip code, and if you don't, or if the address or zip code you have is inaccurate, then the whole thing is just wrong. And so that's kind of one of my hypotheses, is that is the case. Also, you know, as we're doing more and more health equity research, that that information about race and ethnicity is becoming more and more important. However, it's generally incomplete, except for federally qualified health centers who are required now to collect it. But I think at OHSU, I asked someone from Oak Tree, and I believe it was somewhere around like 70% present, which is not really great, right? So a lot of the preliminary work I've done is like on how to improve those particular variables and get either more accurate, more granular, or more complete information about race and ethnicity.
Yeah, I think you know, I think Adam you know, makes some great points about, you know, really what this is about is what you're expecting to find, and then that will guide you know, whatever recommendations or guidelines. I don't think a PhD student should necessarily you know, shy away from developing guidelines. Whatever you want to call them, and you know, maybe Nicole's point about extending existing tools, you know, maybe based on those kinds of paradigms.
Yeah, and I guess I also liked checklist because it seems more flexible, whereas guideline seems a little bit more based on, guidelines seem like something that would vary a great deal from data set to data set, whereas a checklist is kind of something that you can use more broadly across a number of different situations. But yeah, I like Christine's suggestion too about maybe calling it a framework. Framework is good too, has a lot of the same flexibility, but is a little bit more, I don't know, official sounding, academic sounding. Let me see if there's anything else I missed here.
Hey,
Interactive terminal room. Right.
This is Adam. I just wanted to read back one of the things you said. One of the things I think is interesting about what you first said of address information being so critical is that seems like this really valuable piece of linking information that you have. If you have address or zip code, you can link that to other things like percent free or reduced lunch or other social determinants of health. So I wonder, just going forward, what other of those linking variables are so valuable in social determinants of health research? And that seems to me one aspect of data cleaning or quality that is maybe not unique to social determinants of health, but is really prevalent of needing to use these linking variables to then attach to other data sets. So I thought that was really insightful in what you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to some degree, the fact that we use address as the primary way to link people's data is kind of an artifact of the privacy regulations in the United States. For example, like in the UK, they can be a lot more, they can make those linkages a lot more based on individuals because they don't have those same privacy regulations, and they have this nationalized healthcare system, which they can, they have everybody's data. And so, yeah, but here in the US, address data is particularly important. So things like how granular that data is, for example, with the publicly available data sets through the National COVID collaboration, or whatever all those letters stands for, those data sets, like, I believe they do include, they're publicly available, so they include zip code, but it's been anonymized somehow, right? So that really affects what you can reliably link to that particular data set. Or how granular that information is. Like, do you have the person's zip code, or do you have their zip +4, or do you have like what's called the ZCTA? Like, you can get different levels of granularity based on that, right? Sometimes you can only do it by county, which is not very granular at all. And sometimes you can do it by just, places that are in a couple block radius, which is far more accurate. So yeah, address data is particularly important. Thank you for that comment, Adam. I appreciate it. All right. Anybody else have
the very last question in the box from the esteemed Homer Chen: is there an agreed upon set of discrete variables for social determinants? May want to really nail down the definitions early on.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the answer is like not really. There are some things that pretty much everybody puts in there, but sometimes people don't put in environmental factors, for example, when they just call them social behavioral. And sometimes they include the behavioral aspects. So sometimes it might include like smoking. So there are maybe like 70% of the things in there, like race, ethnicity, for example, are pretty much always considered social determinants. And then there's some other things that include the behavioral factors and the environmental factors that not everybody includes in the definition. That can vary a little bit more.
Speaking of addresses, I just put a link. There's a new project, so some of you may have heard about this, that ONC is starting because we don't standardize addresses in the US, and because we don't have a national health identifier, we oftentimes heavily rely on address for linking patients and other things like some of the social determinants things that you're doing. So I don't know if there's anything of interest there.
Yeah, and what we do have is from the Postal Service, right, which is intended to deliver mail, and it's not really meant for research. And so a lot of the work that the census has done is actually a little bit better because they do kind of use it. Their intention is to gather data. But for example, when I was working with the data set, the cystic fibrosis data set, I found maybe like 80 out of the 13,000 data elements I had weren't matching up. And it took me a couple days, but I traced it back to the fact that the US Postal Service had added a zip code to Beaverton like 6 years ago. And so the addresses that I had weren't matching up with the environmental data for that reason. And I had to like go back and correct each in the spreadsheet, which is pretty time consuming. So anytime, right, that the Postal Service decides, oh, we need more zip codes, or we're going to take off the zip code, or we're going to split the zip code in half, like that kind of messes up. It can cause havoc with your research. And they're not making those decisions based on what researchers need. They're basing it on what their postal carriers need.
Yeah, so I mean those, and so those are the kinds of things, it seems, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but those are the kinds of things that might throw off social determinants research if the Postal Service is to slice and dice zip codes. That actually happened years ago with OHSU used to be in a different zip code, and it's probably been about 15 years, but I don't know that it messed up anyone's data, but I do remember it was a big thing because all of a sudden we're supposed to be using a different zip code. Anyways, we're just about out of time. I noticed Eric Wecker makes a good point as well. Another thing that people are realizing is an important social determinant of health is access to broadband internet. And, we've seen the challenges in patient care for people who don't have that access. Does anyone have any last questions or comments? If not, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, this is Nicole. I just wanted to, one last point that I did want to emphasize is that Lily is also proposing that she is going to extend an existing conceptual framework for data quality assessment. So the checklist would be potentially an operationalization or one deliverable, but there is the higher level extension of the CON framework also.
Yes. And then the ramen dough kind of framework around data cleaning also. So I'm trying to draw upon existing work where it's available and things that have been validated and around for a long time.
Yeah, that sounds great. You may want to emphasize that a little bit more. But okay, well, I see that people are already starting to depart. So thank you, Lily, and we'll look forward to hearing about your progress during your dissertation work. And then at some point in the future, we'll look forward to having you back to defend it. Maybe we'll all be back in the office then, and you can do it in the big theater.
That would be great. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you guys again, too.
Great. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay, let me pull up a document in Word so I can read down all of this and also whatever you guys give me. Sorry, I keep using the word guys. I'm trying not to use the word guys.
I struggle with that as well.
But when I'm like nervous and anxious, it comes out.
Okay, Italia, is that someone we want?
I don't think so.
I'm going to expel Italia.
Thank you.
Sorry, Italia.
You're cruel, Andrea.
I know, I love it.
And is
Like,
Miguel around?
What? Who's got host? I have host. I can't get rid of her.
No.
Lily, I'm going to make you, I don't even know if I can make you host, Lily.
Let's see. All I see is people insights, chat, and make presenter. Like the options. It doesn't sound like she's still.
She's not on. I'm sure she just turned it on. So Diane set up this meeting initially, so I don't have a chance to move anybody over to host. So I'm just going to leave the meeting. I won't end it, and then you guys can end it when you're done.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sound
and then
good.
Italia is clearly not on, so she should, once she gets back on, she'll probably leave also.
Wait. Oh wait, there's a host key.
Can you pull it to yourself?
It says
No, it
reclaim
requests
the host
a
role,
key.
It requests a key.
Yeah.
Anybody know what the key is? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. Oh well. Hopefully.
All right. Good luck.
Thank you. Okay. So feedback, further questions?
I thought you did a great presentation. Well done.
Thank you. I guess one thing I'm wondering too is, Nicole, do you, since you're more experienced with the N3C group, data quality and social determinants group, do you have any like kind of things I could fill in for details about how to work the how to use that group to kind of create the iteration?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure of the best language to describe that. And so, as a bit of background for Michelle and Dion, so the social determinants group, they've just explicitly started what they're calling their quality assurance step. And they're basically saying, well, we've got all of these publicly available data sets that have been linked into the actual clinical data, and people are ready to start asking and answering questions using those data, but there's been no data quality assessment done. And, you know, increasingly there's an awareness that there are going to be substantial issues that we really need to at least understand. So Cherise Madlock Brown, who's leading the group, is like, okay, so who wants to be in this meeting? And I was like, me, and also Lily, who's not here. Sorry, Lily. So the hope is that we're going to develop this pipeline that then the people in the group can apply. So there's going to be this kind of built-in iterative process to see like, how well does this pipeline actually work and what kinds of problems are being identified. I don't know how best to capture that process from kind of a formal standpoint in a proposal or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not necessarily, yeah, I guess there isn't a lot of structure to it right now. I mean, it's kind of evolving, or the structure is evolving, I guess.
There are people who are very good at describing this kind of process in a formal way, though. So I'm sure there's got to be something there.
Yeah, and Dion, you know a lot about qualitative methods.
I'm wondering if something from like software engineering.
Okay, so I'm sorry, is the question particular to the COVID project, the NC3 project?
Yeah, and like there's kind of 3 iterations of whatever I'm going to call it, checklist framework or tool. And one of them is to like apply it to the COVID social determinants public data set Nicole and I have been working on, and
Right.
to iterate based on the experience with that. But I feel like that.
I think you're going to have a couple issues. One is the simply time frame.
Mm-hmm.
The COVID process is going to want to work really fast.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And they're not going to have time for you to wait and do a literature search, to be really blunt. So that's got to be something that's done almost on a naive basis, if you will.
Naive.
So, yeah, that means ignorant, but it sounds nice.
It's a.
But you, Nicole, have been thinking about it. So you could, one thing you could do is simply say, okay, let's lay out a process of here are just based on what we know. And please, guys, understand this is a work in process. But here are what we would anticipate based upon what we've seen thus far as being your top 10 list of data quality issues you could think about. Okay, and you can refer back to your frameworks if you want, but then what I would do if I was you, I'd take a look at their data sets and say, and so here's where they're likely to pop up in your data set. If you're looking at non-conformance, looking at, completeness, that type of thing. And I think you could probably talk fairly articulately about that.
Okay.
and then say, okay, and so then say, and then here are different ways you might address those problems. And now this is significantly changing the scope and direction of your project, though, just so you know that. But I think it's on the other hand, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. Second thing I would say is once you do that, then you circulate it to the group, and you have like one-on-ones to the group, probably of people outside the data quality, to say, okay, here are some of the things we're thinking about. How does this meet what your expectations? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you do a straw person, you get input from that, and based upon that, you refine the process for the data munging, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
First step one, maybe just gross data visualization.
Mm-hmm.
Let's simply say, here are the fields we have. Here's the where we're missing. Is this a problem or not? If we're missing 7% of the data, probably don't even have enough to impute. Okay, and that's actually so that's kind of one way you could work with them, but it is a change in your direction. So just take that into account. Second, okay, but that's it sounds like a fantastic opportunity, but it will be it's a different project, and I think for my part, I think obviously Nicole's we're willing to support that, but let's figure out what that is first.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about your timeline, Lily. We'll get to that a little bit. So if we could take, having said that, this meets the requirements for a proposal, I think, for meeting the proposal headline, but I would like to see this reworked a little bit just so we've got a better contract. Something that's going to be more deliverable for you.
Okay.
And this is partially my fault because this
your fault,
opportunity, it is. Because this opportunity with the N3C group arose last minute.
It's great.
But it just seems like it fulfills the purpose of the previous AIM-3 so well, and it is a really good opportunity. But you're right, it changes the dependencies in the proposal somewhat because it's something that's going to start happening
You got to
really
do
soon.
it now. If you're going to start this next July, the ship's going to be gone.
Yeah, these things are going to be happening more in parallel. And Lily has already completed the majority of AIM-2, right?
Yes.
Yes and no.
I mean, yes, I've already done all the data cleaning and I tried to document it as I went. But it isn't like into anything that's like.
Okay, but for AIM-2, what I've seen is basically you're looking at pairwise exclusion.
Pairwise exclusion? You mean like
basically if the data is bad, you throw it out. Okay, and that's not necessarily, you've got on your committee Miguel Marino, who is actually a national expert in imputation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to be able to talk in AIM-2 also about the effects of using different imputation methods and what the opportunities and pitfalls of doing imputation are.
Okay.
And that's a pretty big, I mean, I spent a lot of time on my dissertation going around and around in circles of data imputation. Basically, I could make the data say anything I wanted to if I imputed it right. Which is not exactly good science.
That's one of the more
esoteric.
And subjective things too. So maybe that was why I didn't emphasize it, because I did do a little bit of imputation, and I can show
You're going to have to address it. You're going to have to address it.
Yeah.
I think it is a major thing when you talk about data cleaning, especially with the FCH sets.
Yeah.
Because excluding incomplete data is definitely a health equity issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so not being able to impute it is, I think, is an issue.
Yeah. So for example, the part that I imputed was
you said 152 elements could be inferred from values found elsewhere.
Yeah, right. So insurance status and also even the address, right? Like sometimes, oh, I know whether there was something that isn't in here, but like whether or not that person was, the patient had been active in the program on particular years, right? So, for example, you couldn't really tell, the registry will confirm people's address annually. However, you can't tell if the person wasn't a patient that year, or what happened was that they just didn't answer their phone, and so the registry was unable to confirm, right?
Okay.
So for a lot of the times, if if somebody was a patient for every other 9 out of the 10 years, and then in the middle they weren't showing up, then what I did was just assume or impute that they got missed that year.
Okay. Yeah, so that's just a comment. And so, yeah, so what I would hope you would do is you'd be looking at what happens for data if you impute it or not, and how that changes the results. You're looking at the multiverse as General suggested. Can we go back to aim 1? And I'm sorry, I talked too much.
No, you're not talking too much. Okay, yes, aim
I
1.
do. Okay, aim 1.
Okay.
To what degree is this a broad framework that will include data quality issues within an EHR only, within an EHR when matching with address data, or with an EHR and matching with other, for example, registry data?
Mm-hmm.
So what's your limitation here, Lily? And that's just for the, in my, and think about it also in terms of what you can do for the code. But at some point, you've got to be able to tell us what, if you're doing the whole field, I would say you're over ambitious with all the scope you've got here. But I'd also think about how you would want to tailor it, given your access now to the COVID data. And so, and so I'm just saying, let's think about it and make sure that it's, try and make it doable. And maybe even lose part of the, honestly, I would be willing, if you took and you really expanded your work with the COVID team, I think that plus doing your own work, plus doing the lit search, is probably enough for a good article, and maybe you don't have to go to the best practices. How's that for any rather than the checklist?
Oh, okay.
And I don't know what other committee members think, but I just think that there's doing 2 significant projects is plus the lit review is a lot of work, and definitely. And think about it as setting you up for getting your initial K grant as using that work to develop your best practices. So I'm as I said, I'm really worried about the timeline. Yeah. So for aim 1, what I would really like you to do is to specify very clearly what combinations of data sets you're going to be looking at. Okay, or what types of data elements. And I'm not unwilling to support anyone you want, but recognize that the broader your net, the more time it's going to take.
Right. I mean,
Michelle,
initially, yeah, my thought was to just make it all
I don't need an answer now.
Oh, okay.
But I'm just saying, but I'm saying I would like a different draft, and it can be just of this PowerPoint or whatever you want that specifies a little more clearly what types of data elements you're willing to look at.
Okay.
And that's all. Michelle, I can't hear you.
I agree with Deanne about that. Mostly the way I would say it is, my concern is that I think your COVID analysis is going to be a big part of your work, but right now it's just like a sub point of aim 3. And it seems like, especially from what Deanne just said, is there a way to make that almost aim 2? So it's more of a focus. And then I don't know if aim 3 could then be going back to your work that you already did with the cystic fibrosis and then applying what you did there. I mean, I don't know how much you're going to say what you've done with the air quality and the cystic fibrosis informs what you did with COVID or vice versa, or if you could use that data set as an example of showing lessons learned from your COVID data analysis, how they apply to a different data set. Do you know what I'm saying? Because right now it seems like you're doing the focus is on the cystic fibrosis, and then you're kind of seeing like, how does this work with COVID? Does it make sense to shift the focus the other way if you anticipate spending most of your time doing the analysis of data quality of the COVID data set?
That's a good point. And especially given that the COVID research, as Dan pointed out, is very timely, like the timeline's very tight. And so it might make more sense to make aim 2 about that instead.
Yeah, and the other thing, just from my experience with research, is that, at least for me, I do much better and I'm far more successful when I'm working with other people in a group on a project and you're getting input from these other people. And I think that that's going to make that work go faster and be easier. So the more that can be kind of the emphasis of your work, I think the more successful you're going to be and potentially the more on time you're going to be.
I agree. And I feel like that was a huge part of the motivation actually for getting involved in the N3C, for agreeing to do what Nicole suggested is like, wow, I get access to this whole team of people and they'll have momentum and they'll have expertise and they'll be able to give me feedback on a regular basis.
Yes.
And that is like enormously appealing. In addition to the fact that COVID's just like interesting and it's important, but I think the bigger appeal is having that team of people. So that is another good reason to make the NC3 thing part of aim 2 rather than aim 3.
Mm-hmm.
And from my standpoint, you could do it a bunch of different ways. And I think you do need to do a lit search.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that's just it's part of the suffering you have to do. But you could do it a lit search, and your 2 aims are case study 1 and case study 2. In case study 1, I would put up to be your COVID work, and then go back and do some cleanup. You could do it to do a lit search case study, which is the COVID, and then do it in the COVID process. Try drafting some guidelines, and then take that to a panel, and just forget going back and reanalyzing your data. You could do, so you could do 2 case studies. You could do as it is. You could do, you've got 4 parts, I think. Pick 2 or 3.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, part 1 is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And I don't, any one of them is, for me, it would be great. I think the COVID is going to be much, I'm going to say, it's going to be a much better platform to work from in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be, as my money and banking professor, I had a Swiss money and banking professor. And he told me that it would be a America experience. Yeah, America. Much richer.
And it has a lot of like recognition and interest from lots of people.
Plus, just the fact that it's real time, you're working with some great data sources that you probably wouldn't access before, and you're going to have people you can get to give you immediate feedback, and you're going to be on the firing line. Yeah, have fun.
I also have to say, as far as like guidelines go, the end product for my dissertation was a conceptual framework and a guideline. And I sweat blood over that guideline. And I don't think anyone has ever used it. People like the conceptual framework. They like something they can look at on a page. But that will get a lot more use probably, and unfortunately, than something like a guideline a lot of the time.
Mhm.
I'm afraid Bill's right. Checklist is a dirty word to some people.
Mhm.
I was a little peeved with that comment.
Well, yeah, but have you ever talked to a surgeon about a checklist?
Yeah, I just think about things like, like the consort guideline and all the other equator network reporting guidelines, when really what it boils down to is a checklist, and they call it a checklist. But it's a semantics issue.
Bill,
Did Tool Gawande ruin it for everyone?
Probably.
hey, he's gonna be on Biden's team.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
What's
He's
he
one
doing?
of-
Bye.
He's one of the healthcare advisors for the transition right now.
Oh, okay.
And so the question is, what's his role going to be ongoing?
Okay, so pick 2 or 3 to make this timeline more doable. Definitely make the let's search part of it, and we all feel there's a really strong case for making NC3 part of it.
Okay, and can we talk about the manuscript writing process? Because we've got almost a real-time manuscript writing process, which takes a lot of discipline. And Nicole, were you able to write yours on a real-time basis?
Yes. Yeah, for the most part.
Okay, I'm glad you could. For me, that was really hard.
It's hard, yeah. Well, you are also doing a lot of qualitative analysis, which is so time consuming, right?
Yeah, no. It's just lack of discipline. Be really honest. So, but to be serious, so typically, the way my committee wanted me to work with the process was that I would write my methods. Okay. Right at the beginning. So the methods would be done, like for lit review, the methods would actually be done. Your methods section would be written on the 24th of December. That makes sense. And you'd actually see your methods, write your methods section. That guides what you're going to do, and get that out. So you get comments from your committee, at least Nicole, and maybe your committee at certain points. As you go, and typically it goes methods. Okay, then you do your analysis. You write up your analysis section, and then you can discussion conclusions of the abstract altogether. But you want to take and you basically you need to get those done in sequential order. But definitely get your methods done before you start. You might even do the background. Background you could do background and methods you could do first. Okay, then do analysis discussion, and then you're typically what happened was we'd this is what we did. We'd write the conclusion and the abstract at the end. Is that the process you used, Nicole, or then Michelle?
I found it varied somewhat with the methods. I tried to have the methods hammered out beforehand, definitely, but stuff changed as I went along.
Yeah.
Right. But you needed to have a draft that you had starting out. If you're going to need a 6-week if you're going to need a 9-week framework for getting this done, it's going to take that. And that's going to be really key to you're getting this thing done. And remember that it's not just the time for you to write, it's the time for Nicole and then maybe at some points Michelle and I and Miguel to review what you're doing. And so it's frustrating. It's going to be frustrating as hell. But that's kind of the way you got to do it. Because the last thing you want to do is hand somebody a final paper and say, this is it, and you go, Lily, I think you missed something at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's, the extent, for me at least, the extent I could bring my committee along with me, saved a lot of trouble at the end. And when I didn't, it was a real pain.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I have found really helpful for staying on a timeline for writing manuscripts is applying for conferences. So if you say that you are going to do a presentation on X, Y, and Z at AMIA and you submit a podium abstract and it gets accepted, well, you better get that work done within that time span. And then I find the process of going through creating a slide deck is actually really, really helpful for working out the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably not ideal that I submit podium abstracts for things I haven't finished, but I think that's what happens a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
Okay.
yeah, I don't know if you saw, but Diane also sent out an email that you have until June of 2022 to get your work done. So your timeline can be expanded a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, and the next conference coming up, there's a clinical informatics conference coming up May 18th to 20th, and the submission deadline is January 5th.
Yeah, I think that was just extended. So yeah, that was my first thought is go for that one.
Is that a good venue for presenting a lit review, or would you be presenting more of your initial data from the COVID work?
Good question. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think you'd have a higher chance of acceptance if you talked about this will be a real-time report on the process of developing quality metrics for data to be used in COVID research.
Okay.
I don't know if the clinical informatics conference is going to be the best venue, though.
Okay.
What do you think?
What do you think would be better?
Okay, so here is the objectives for this conference: is to apply evidence or experience-based models of informatics processes to improve healthcare. I think this kind of fits that. Leverage tools, yeah. Okay, identify relevant mental, public, and population health informatics strategies for health issues. Might be applicable. Identify diversity, equity, inclusion issues through the lens of clinical informatics.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not that bad. But yeah, there may be other ones. I'm sure there are.
Is there something else that a different format that you feel would work? You said maybe the AMIA one wouldn't be the best. Is there something else that would work better in your opinion, Nicole?
So the one that you're talking about is the clinical informatics one?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Me, clinical informatics.
I mean, my initial thought was that a summit or annual symposium would be a better fit, but based on what Deanne was just saying, I could be totally off base on that. I mean, my view is just that the clinical informatics one is more focused on healthcare delivery,
Yes.
and very patient focused.
Okay. I'm writing all this down.
I wonder if there are going to be any sessions for summits.
And Michelle, do You've been quiet. Do you have any feedback
But-
or ideas or?
Yeah, I'm just looking here and I'm seeing in Nicole's pictures on the scientific program committee for the summit. I've
So
never
I should know about late breaking sessions, but I don't.
Yeah, I've never gone to summit, so I'm not very familiar with it. I was just wondering, I mean, I know that the deadlines for the annual symposium are in March. I don't know if having that extra time would give you more substance in either a podium presentation, abstract, or even if you might have enough for like a preliminary paper that you could write up. So the advantage of that would be you would have a broader focused conference and maybe a little bit more time for a more developed submission.
Yeah. And I think that could be a really good place to submit the actual paper for what's currently AIM 2 also.
Okay.
What do you guys think?
Actually, I'm just looking at the IEEE stuff. And they have something that the deadline submission is the 15th November, data science and smart healthcare, challenges and opportunities. Looking at how they integrate social data. So that's to look for that to come out. So that's all.
15th of November, though? Did it already?
It's passed, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well past.
Too bad.
But yeah, but it looks like there's a bunch of stuff. Yeah, that I would look for in the IEEE's, just tons of stuff going on there. I don't know if it's any good, but there's a lot of stuff. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna need to run, I'm afraid, and I apologize.
Oh, yeah.
But I
No,
think
we're
this
going
was very
over
good, Lily. And yeah, you're really coming along.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
I will I'll incorporate that feedback in.
yeah, it's not a straight line, I'm sorry.
It never is. That's okay.
Thank you. You take care.
Thanks, Deanne.
I feel like I'm saying goodbye to my grandson. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. Anything else I need to put in here? Any other revisions I need to make or ideas?
One other comment I had about was, depending on how you decide you want to implement this framework, and I don't know how much of this is important to really hammer out right now in the proposal stage, but when you get feedback from experts and you're using, if you're using questions from like the usability scale, that's really intended to be for a very specific use case. So you might want to think about that. So if you are working with experts on this N3C data and you're coming up with this stuff, maybe trying to figure out in the process of doing it, how you make that iterative and how you get that feedback, and getting that feedback to be as targeted as you possibly can. If you decide that you want to apply it to a second use case, let's say the cystic fibrosis data, then you'd probably want to get specific feedback from other people on that use case as well. But I don't know if you can just hand someone like a framework and ask them like how usable you think this would be without giving them a specific data set or task. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it might, if you're looking for that level of feedback, it might be more useful to think about how you might incorporate that into your overall process of working with people on this data as you go.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure how that, I am having trouble kind of wrapping my head around exactly how you do that. But that would be my only comment about that. I'm not sure I'd have it sort of so separate because I think that's going to be a real challenge.
That's a good point.
I mean, one option in terms of trying to find the right methodology and terminology for that iterative process would be looking at software engineering methods. And I dropped in a Wikipedia link because a lot of the time the language that you'll see around that, like agile, spiral method, etc., have been applied pretty broadly beyond just software development, and it might work in this kind of setting. And the other thing that's possible would be just talking to people who have a strong history of being successful with that kind of approach. Because there are ways to write it so that it sounds formal instead of ad hoc. And I'm not personally super great at that, but I'm thinking, Dave Dorr is pretty good at that kind of thing. Adam Wilcox. And I would even listen to the talk that Sue Bakken gave recently. The
Missed that.
Autonomics one.
Yeah.
There's supposed to be a video cast. It's not available. When I checked last, it wasn't available. It might be now. But they used like a very iterative process for developing conveying health information to patients potentially with low health literacy. And the way she describes it, it sounds very formal and well developed and comprehensive. I think a lot of it is just in how she describes it. And then in reality, there is kind of a lot of loosey-goosiness to the actual process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know, I mean, because the way we usually talk about this is, sort of like the user-centered design, iterative kind of development. So I don't know if it makes sense to think about it as, first of all, you're trying to do this to analyze and potentially improve, although I don't know how much power or ability you're going to have to improve this N3C data set, but you're going to be analyzing this. So, but at the same time, you want to make, you don't just want to, like, you're not just doing this because you care about this data. You're actually trying to then make at the same time sort of a framework or guidelines or lessons learned or flow chart or something like that. And so how that gets kind of incorporated into it, and it's sort of like this iterative process of developing these best practices or this flow chart or something like that for tackling, social determinants of health. In this case, it's for the data in COVID, but you're hoping it'd be applicable to other data sets as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's almost like a very simple questionnaire that you could design that would go along with this tool or this flow chart or whatever it is as we're developing it, where it's just like, I mean, the nice thing is you don't need to recruit people because people are going to be trying to apply these steps. And say like, what was the concept that you were looking at, in which data set or data sets, and were there parts of this that were really helpful or parts that were not helpful or confusing, or were there things that were missing from this? And make it almost more like an issue tracking thing.
Yeah. I like that. I like that it's issue tracking. Yeah, I think I need to more carefully consider how it would kind of fit into the research workflow, and then therefore.
Yeah, but I think that's a whole part of what you're trying to propose, right? Is that you're trying to like look at this from like a a higher level view as you're doing it, as opposed to just this ad hoc, how do I get my data in some format that I can use it, right? Whether I'm just, okay, oh, I think I'll just impute here, or, oh, this data is missing, I'm just going to eliminate them, right? So instead of doing that, you're kind of like, okay, this is my data, this is the characteristics. So there's got to be some kind of characterization that happens. I don't know whether it's using visualizations too, but then when you come up with these different issues and there are decisions to be made, how do you kind of enumerate what the options are? And then how do you decide between them? And it may be that you can't definitively say how, you can't necessarily come up with rules, depending on what they are, right? But that's the way I think this would be helpful. I mean, from my perspective, doing this kind of stuff, this is what I think would be really helpful, is like being able to, kind of go through this, especially, with respect to this, this data, the social determinant data.
And I know this might sound like potentially like a big shift in what you had proposed. So, I mean, if it's making you feel uncomfortable with this change in direction, I definitely want to talk about that. But I will also say that even though it sounds like a big thing with a lot of moving parts, I think in a lot of ways, this will be easier than what you had proposed for your AIM 3. Because a lot of it is a process that is already in motion. So yeah, I mean, obviously, again, if there's anything about it that you're not comfortable with, like, we want to talk about it, but I do think that this will make the whole thing a little bit more feasible in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also think we can talk about, if you want, or you could talk about with Nicole, what makes sense for you to solidify right now in the proposal. And then, and then going ahead, then what, because at this point, we just want to make sure you have a good sense of what it is you're going to do and you have a direction, right? Mm-hmm. But I've been on enough of these committees to know that it's more the exception than the rule that anyone ever follows that to a T. Things always come up and you wind up kind of, this part took longer, so this became more of my focus and we had to drop this off, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, the first thing is to realize, number one, is that this is not like, it's not some blood contract that you're signing up for that you have to do perfectly the way you say right now. And so, right, it might be helpful to figure out, well, what kind of an outline do you need right now to kind of make sure that you're on the right path and it's going to really reflect the work that you're doing and the work that's going to be the easiest for you to do, the one that's going to be most motivating, that's going to, that you're most interested in, knowing that there's always going to be things that kind of come up that might sway sort of where you wind up going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To build that expectation of flexibility in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, again, once you get to the point of defending your dissertation, if you put up 3 good aims there, no one's going to be like, this isn't what was in your proposal. No, I mean, the point of the proposal is really to make sure you are ready to move on. It's not a contract.
Well, and I will tell you too, that when the aims that you propose for a grant often aren't exactly what you wind up doing either. The aims you propose for a grant are what you think your the review committee is the most interested in hearing about. It's not necessarily the work you wind up actually publishing and doing. So that's a whole nother can of worms that's, a dissertation doesn't have to deal with. But yeah, we just want to make sure you have a good framework and direction so that you have, at least what you're doing next week and next month, but the stuff that's like 6 or 9 months out maybe isn't as crystal clear. but you've got some idea of where you're going and you know what your next steps are.
Mhm.
Yeah. So do you have any questions for us at this point? I know we've taken you for a long time. You might have to go.
Oh, it's okay. No, I don't. I think that's all really helpful feedback, and I especially appreciate like clarifying the ideas, but also like helping me to make it more feasible and doable, and like something to make sure I don't bite off more than I can possibly do
Mhm.
over the next, year or so.
Yeah, but I think having the opportunity to work with the N3C data is just a really good opportunity for you. I think it's going to be good to work with those people, but I also think it's going to be stuff that's going to be potentially, highly desirable to be published, so that's going to be something that, I could tell you from the aspect of working on data and ophthalmology that a lot of times I get that we don't care.
Eyeballs.
Yeah, who cares? But like COVID, people care about, right? So, I think there's a lot to like, even if it is a little bit of a detour from what you had originally maybe thought you were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
From the whole like year that I spent studying wildfire. And I hesitate to throw that away, but it was valuable in lots of other ways.
No, but I think you're still going to have opportunities to draw back on that. It's just trying to figure out how to do that in a good way, while still moving forward in this other direction that is a little bit more time sensitive or critical and is potentially going to be more productive for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe I could just use that wildfire work as like, okay, I'll get published in a field that's kind of social determinants adjacent, and that's like that's good.
But it's sort of like preliminary work. I mean, it's sort of
Yeah,
demonstrating, well, I've done this before. I've seen these issues. This is what's come up. Now I'm applying it to this new kind of.
Yeah. And I still think if you can get that published, like the informatics view of that, and I do think AMIA might be a really good place for that. That's your second aim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Michelle, what are the big next steps? Because it sounds like Deanne does want some updated draft of either the proposal or the slides.
For me, I don't really care which one it is. I just think having a good kind of outline of the aims and kind of reflecting where you think your focus is going to be over the next, year. I do like her wanting you to put some structure around the lit review and trying to get that done. But I do think if you decide that the N3C is kind of an important issue for you, it might be, and I don't know how much of that is going to constrain your lit search versus if you weren't doing it for that application. I don't know. I mean, I'm having a hard time kind of thinking that through, like what your lit review would do. When if you were trying to focus on COVID data, I'm not sure it's going to change much because you're still talking about, social determinants of health, how you link to potentially public. So, like that stuff's still there. So I don't know. But I also don't know kind of what the N3C timeline is and what you're working on with them right now. And so how to balance those two out. Like, how do you get the lit review done while you're trying, what's the focus now, what you're doing with that group. So I think trying to, kind of figure out a plan for how to do both of those maybe consecutively might be helpful. Not necessarily in the proposal, but just for yourself, thinking that through.
So maybe like an updated timeline and an updated, just like one-page summary of the aims and the components. Do you think that would be?
I think so.
Yeah. How does that sound?
Do that.
Okay.
And it's the end of the term, and I have to do grading for for scientific writing. So I could probably have that by like the end of the next week.
Yeah, and I think technically you have until the 31st to get the proposal done and signed off on within this term. So I'll send an email after this to Dion and just make sure she would be okay accepting like an updated timeline in that one-page description. But yeah, I think that should be sufficient. So I'll just make sure.
Okay.
And then I think we've got a little bit of flexibility in terms of when you would need to get that to us.
Okay.
So you can prioritize the grading.
And I do think it's worth thinking about where or how you're going to publish some of the work with the N3C stuff. And maybe that's already sort of in the works, like you're already, and I don't know how soon that's going to happen, but given the timeliness of the topic, I would kind of try and figure that out. Like, is that going to be a conference? Is that going to be, a conference abstract, conference paper, or is it going to be a journal article?
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to be, because I think that's going to help you kind of figure out how to prioritize all of this.
It's a good point. And I think Cerise is good at that kind of strategizing. So we can also talk to her. Guys, one of my cats is super stoned right now because we had to take her to the vet. And all she wants to do is sleep. And the kitten is like chewing on her face. And it's really cute and also really sad.
Aw. Stoned on what?
Gabapentin.
Oh.
A lot of vets recommend it before a visit for cats that get stressed out.
Oh.
No, she's just chill.
She's really pretty sloppy.
Wait, can we see? Can you point your...
Yeah, let's see. Let me know. Can you guys see this?
That's pretty cute.
She would usually just have him pinned. And she can't.
Oh, I miss kitties.
They're pretty great. So I apologize.
Yes, no, I love it. Okay, I can do that, all of those things, like the updated timeline, updated one-page summary of the aims and components, and then maybe a little bit of more detail about where and how to publish the N3C stuff into, what I'm going to apply for and stuff that will help me meet those deadlines in the way that Cole talked about earlier. Okay, I can do that.
All right, and I'm drafting this email to Dion right now. Do you want me to CC you on that, Lily, or would you rather I loop you in afterwards?
You can CC me. That would be helpful.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. And again, Lily, great job. I think people were into your presentation and your topic.
Yeah, I'm glad I got questions and there was a pretty good chat.
Yeah, and just seeing it develop over the last several months, I mean, it's really impressive, I think.
Especially given everything going on right now.
Yes. I wish I had work like that to show for this past several months.
All right. Well, I hope you get a chance to relax a little bit today.
Yes, I will try with all the grading. Relax with grading.
Oh,
But
yeah,
I really
super chill.
appreciate all your time and feedback and support too. So thank you guys.
All right, good luck.
Bye now. Thanks.
All right. Bye.